It appears that Israel has conducted 2 major assassinations in the region with potential consequences that are hard to wrap your head around. The first was Fuad Shukr. He is the most senior military commander in Hezbollah. That assassination occurred in Beirut. And the second was Ismail Haniyeh, assassinated in Tehran in Iran. He was there for the inauguration of the new Iranian president, and he is the top political leader of Hamas. Joining us to break down the context of this and the potential consequences, where we could be headed, is Dr. Trita Parsi. He, of course, is with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Great to see you, sir.
Good to be with you again.
So what is your initial reaction to these astounding events?
Well, I think we have to assume that this is done by Israel, given the track record of Israel doing these type of things, particularly mindful of the attack that you also mentioned against the Hezbollah commander. So if we assume that, we have to ask ourselves what the objective is here, beyond obviously the desire to take out Haniyeh. They could have taken out Haniyeh at any moment. He was living in Qatar. They knew exactly where he was. The fact that they took him out while he was in Tehran on the day of the inauguration of the Iranian president, I think is designed to send a couple of messages. One of those messages is, of course, that they are trying to undermine any opportunity that Pezeshkian's election would bring about for renewed U.S.-Iran diplomacy, something the Israelis have opposed since the mid-1990s. Secondly, is to send a clear signal to both Iran and the different groups that Iran is supporting, from Hezbollah to the Houthis to Iraqi militias, that they're not safe, they're not even safe in Iran, and that Iran actually cannot protect them. This is deeply, deeply embarrassing for Iran, of course, particularly if it turns out that some of the reporting that is coming out now is true, which is that he was actually in or very near the presidential compound when he was assassinated. And then you have to ask yourself, so if the Israelis are doing something that they know is deeply embarrassing to the Iranians, they're clearly doing it because they know that that will maximize the likelihood that Iran will respond. And that will then, as a result, and of course, trigger an escalatory spiral that seems to have been in the mind of Netanyahu when he ordered this, if, of course, it is Israel, but I think it's safe to assume that it is.
That's what I wanted to ask about next. What do you expect in terms of the Iranian response? What could we be saying? What could we be seeing in the days ahead, in the hours ahead, actually, potentially from Iran as it plots its response to what happened just in the last 12 or so hours?
So I think contrary to the image that has been presented of the Iranian leadership in Washington, I think it's quite clear that the Iranian leadership tends to actually be a rather cautious and very calculating actor. That's part of the reason why it's become such a potent foe of Israel and the United States. And we saw that in the response that the Iranians gave when the Israelis attacked the Iranian embassy in Damascus, the consular compound of it. It was a very measured response to make sure that it inflicted damage on Israel, but not so much that Israel would have a strong grounds for further escalation, and it seems to have had some coordination with the Biden administration. This time around, however, I think it is much more difficult to count on that type of a response, that type of a calibrated response that is designed to strike back, but without escalating, for that actually to be able to succeed for a variety of reasons. First of all, this was an attack against Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran within the span of 12 hours. This likely means that the response will be a coordinated response with Iran and several of these different actors, which then, of course, would be different from what we saw in April. Those other actors do not have the same discipline, nor do they have necessarily the same objectives in terms of, we've seen clear tensions between the Houthis wanting to escalate much more and the Iranians holding them back. So I do fear that this has created a very, very explosive situation. The Iranians are likely going to respond together with some of these other actors. And I think the Netanyahu government knew exactly what they did, given the fact that we are now in a lame duck period of the Biden administration. Biden has proven himself unwilling and incapable of putting any pressure on Israel in the past, except in that instance when it came to the strike against Syria. But this time around, perhaps he will not even have that. And as a result, the risk of a further escalation that drags the U.S. into it is much, much higher than it was before.
Dr. Parsi, one of the things that you wrote on Twitter and your initial reaction to these assassinations was that this may be an attempt by Bibi Netanyahu to box Kamala Harris in. It's still an open question whether she really wants to move away from the Biden policy with regard to Israel, but that's certainly a possibility, an ongoing possibility. And so lay out for us your logic of how this could box Kamala Harris in and why Bibi Netanyahu would want to do that.
Well, first, on the issue as to whether she is moving away from Biden's policy or not, I think you're quite right. We don't know quite yet, but I think we can point to the fact that both the body language and on a rhetorical level, there is a shift, and it's a rather important shift. Any substantive shift will have to be preceded by such a rhetorical shift. Now, it doesn't mean that the rhetorical shift automatically will lead to it, but if we were to see a substantive shift, this is one of the first steps that we would see. But more importantly, how does Netanyahu perceive this? Given the fact that he will not take any chances, I assume that based on the conversation he had with Kamala Harris, what she said publicly, the body language, etc., he would be quite unlikely to calculate that Harris is not going to try to shift away, not just rhetorically, but on substance, away from where Biden has been, which incidentally is not terribly hard. I mean, the bar is very, very low here, right? So given that, what does he do now before she actually potentially becomes president? Of course, this is all assuming that she would win. I think one of the things that he would want to do is to box her in, create a crisis that forces her into the same type of a bear hug that Biden voluntarily chose to adopt after October 7th. And by that crisis also take away the opportunity for her to have the initiative. She's going to be forced to react rather to be able to come in as president, if she wins, of course, with a new policy and a new initiative. She will only be able to respond to him and the crisis that he has created rather than actually being able to come in and decide, essentially sends strong signals to Israel of what she would like them to do. Instead, she's going to be responding.
And there's already been some speculation about the potential for, if this is confirmed as an Israeli, which it obviously appears to be, what does that mean for how it could backfire potentially if there is a Harris administration? If there is, going forward, it does look like this is something that the U.S. and their relationship or our relationship with Iran, there's a total. This is a new situation. This kind of upends the diplomacy efforts as meager as they were. So is there any chance that it backfires on Netanyahu? And there are a million different ways that could happen, but even just if there is, an escalation and the U.S. is even more or even, less, the public in the United States is even less supportive of Netanyahu's war effort, that puts politicians in a different situation too.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think on a strategic level in the long run, we have seen a lot of these different stunts by Netanyahu backfiring when it comes to his long-term interests. Tactically, he may be able to gain some things, but in the long term, it has backfired. Even the attack on April 1 against the consulate of Iran in Damascus, I think backfired because it also forced Biden to finally actually put some red lines in front of Netanyahu, something that he clearly had not done when it comes to Netanyahu's slaughter in Gaza. But nevertheless, in the short run, I think it's going to unfortunately have similar impacts as we've seen before. But I think one of the things that is happening right now is that it's becoming increasingly clear to an increasing number of Americans who don't want to see the United States go into more wars in the Middle East, who don't want to see the United States get dragged into wars, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere, are tired of these forever wars, that the one country that is most likely and most intent on dragging the U.S. into such a war is Israel. It's not just, what is happening in Europe, et cetera. And I think this is also starting to become more clear on the conservative side, where I think support for Israel perhaps has been a little bit more reflexive than it has been on the Democratic side for the last 10 years. So there is a big shift amongst the American populace. And I think if this leads to a large escalation and American body bags come home from this war, then I think tactically perhaps it had helped Netanyahu. He just wants to prolong his reign as prime minister. Strategically, I think it will be very bad for Israel.
Last question I have for you, Dr. Parsi. Control room, if you could put the final element, I believe we have it labeled C4, up on the screen. This was Jeremy Scahill over at Dropsite News, interviewed a scholar of Hezbollah, Amal Saad, and asked, this was before the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, asked what a war with Hezbollah could look like. And in part, he said, listen, we're talking here about a much more sophisticated military organization, well over 100,000 fighters, well over that number, over 150,000 missiles and rockets. He went on to say, from all the information I've been gathering, it would actually lead to the unraveling of the Israeli state. We're not talking here about just a defeat for Israel like in 2006. It would be the sort of defeat that would actually lead to its demise. I'd love for you to react to that, if you agree with that assessment, and lay out for us in a little bit starker detail the escalatory spiral and where it could lead and what it could mean for the U.S. in particular.
Well, as was said in that interview, more than 100,000 fighters. We're talking about more than 150,000 projectiles. We know that Israel's air defenses are not as impenetrable as many thought them to be, mindful of the fact that the Iranians managed to get 9 ballistic missiles through, as well as a much more sophisticated technological base for that fighting force. Given all of that, and particularly if it then also means that the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and others will be involved, it is no longer a question as to whether militarily where the balance ends up. It's whether a state like Israel can sustain such a conflict. And I think already seeing 10 months into the war in Gaza, in which the Israelis are not suffering militarily, but nevertheless they're failing strategically and even tactically, how that has created very, very strong ruptures within Israeli society. We've seen how the right wing there and very hardline elements have gotten more and more leeway, to the point of what we saw just in the last couple of days, in which they were attacking prisons in order to be able to release Israeli soldiers that had been arrested because of the torture that they had conducted against Palestinian prisoners, and now they have been released. Once again, they won. We've seen how that country's gone more and more in a very, very radical direction. Such a radical direction almost invites self-implosion. This is at least a part of the narrative that exists out in the Middle East. Part of the reason why they think that such a military confrontation with Israel, even if it is lost militarily, strategically, nevertheless, it will lead to the collapse of Israel. Whether it's true or not is really impossible to say, but there clearly are signs in support of that analysis, given what is happening in Israel today.
Dr. Parsi, it's always so great to have your insights, and especially on such a consequential day. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.